So we want to start there with that impeachment inquiry. I know originally you had said at the beginning of this process you thought that this was a distraction from Democrats.
Right.
Any change there? Have you changed your mind after everything that's happened?
No, we'll see what more comes out. We're going to get briefed next week. And of course, there is today, as we're taping this, interviews going on with the former ambassadors, so maybe new things will come out. But you've got to remember, people have wanted to impeach President Trump since the day he took office. And there are reasons why he is more of a lightning rod or hated prior to his predecessors. He is trying to drain the swamp. You know, we haven't had a president before who wants to really redo these trade deals. We haven't had a president before who cares about people coming in across the border. And there are a lot of people who want to go back to the days of anybody who wants can come here. There are people who want to go back to the days of we don't care how big a trade imbalance we have. So as long as he is different than what I guess I'll call the swamp, you're going to have a lot of people trying to impeach him. Now, if he did something wrong, we'll see if that comes out today.
Is there doubt in your mind that he might have done something wrong?
I don't think he did something impeachable, but we'll have to see.
What are you expecting to learn from that briefing? I know you don't know the facts yet, but what kinds of things could you learn in that briefing?
Well, we had the transcript of the phone call with the Ukraine, and we didn't see anything there that was impeachable. As a matter of fact, I think maybe the Democrats were disappointed as how little was there.
But they said it wasn't verbatim.
Right. But you know, there was nothing there that rose to the level of impeachment. There are so many other things that we want to do in Washington that the thing that really frustrates me is the degree to which those things are being pushed on the back burner.
But do you think it's appropriate for a president to ask a foreign country to investigate a political rival?
I think it was a frustrating thing for President Trump because I think the press should have driven some sort of investigation on that 4 years ago.
But do you think it would be appropriate for a president to do that?
Well, I think it depends on the context or depends upon what's going on. President Trump is somewhat of a unique president. There's something in his brain that comes out of his mouth, right? I think it was highly wrong, if what it appears like happened here, that Vice President Biden's son was making a lot of money, and perhaps a prosecutor was switched around at the Ukraine, perhaps at Vice President Biden's request. I mean, there's something where really U.S. policy, you could say, changed or money was made by using family connections. I haven't seen anything that bad yet from President Trump.
Let's say, though, so you say it kind of depends upon who the president is at the time. So let's say the president...
I'm not saying it's who the president is at the time. I'm saying whether it appears as though there's a quid pro quo there, and we haven't seen that yet.
Let's say the president were a Democrat. The facts were the same. There were possibly more than one whistleblower coming forward. Would you want to go ahead with an impeachment inquiry if the president were a Democrat?
Well, first of all, let's remember, if the things were switched around, if Mike Pence's son were making money in a situation like that, I think there's no question but that the media would be having a field day, and that would have been fleshed out years ago.
Well, what would you be doing?
Well, I think we'd be demanding. You mean if it was Vice President Pence, if he had a son over there, and a Democrat was asking it to be investigated? Absolutely. If Vice President Pence had a son who was making money like that off of Vice President Pence's connections, I think it's something that should be looked into.
Well, so to reword my question, I think some people are saying Republicans are supporting the president because he's a Republican. If this were a Democrat, they would be saying impeach him all the way. So I'm asking you, is that the case?
No, I don't think so. I think impeachment's a drastic thing. And I think when the press says Republicans are all behind President Trump or they are afraid to disagree with President Trump, that's not true at all. I mean, you look at what's going on this week with regard to the Kurds in Turkey. You look what went on before I left when the big budget deal came down and President Trump wanted so desperately to have Republicans support him, and the vast majority of Republicans didn't support him. Again and again and again, the Republicans are not afraid to disagree with President Trump. But I think when it comes down to something so drastic as impeachment, particularly when I think so much of that impeachment is being pushed by people who fundamentally disagree with President Trump on the border, who fundamentally disagree with President Trump getting out there on trade, I think you just have to look at it a little bit skeptically.
According to a new Fox News poll, more than half of U.S. voters want President Trump impeached. That's 51%. What do you make of that?
Well, I guess they'd have to look at the question. I'm told that that poll, you know, if you look at the question, you really can't hang your hat on that 51%. And anyway, it's one of those things, too much of what we do today is poll driven. But the story on the impeachment or what President Trump may or may not have done really changes every day, certainly changes every week. So I don't get excited about that poll, particularly because I think sometimes it depends who you ask the questions of and how the question is worded.
The White House says that it will not cooperate with this investigation. Is that a good idea?
Well, I think they're going to cooperate as soon as we take a vote in the House, and I wouldn't be surprised if we take that vote.
What do you think about that strategy of coming out and saying we won't cooperate with this?
Well, I think the administration, to a degree, is concerned. They don't want to have all of their inner workings immediately exposed to the public. For example, when people wanted transcripts, which eventually were let out there, transcripts in dealing with foreign leaders. You know, if a foreign leader is going to go back and forth with a U.S. president, I think it's a valid concern. Is that going to wind up on the front page of the American newspapers?
Let's talk about Syria, something really important. Republicans are now coming out against the president for pulling troops out of northern Syria. Where do you stand with that decision?
I'm going to get briefed, I assume, by Pompeo next week when I go back to Washington. On the surface, I don't like the decision. I wish that people had not been so hostile to the idea of President Trump working with Russia on things. I think the key to protecting the Kurds went through Russia, particularly after Assad did so well in that Syrian civil war. And I think it was a mistake for so many American politicians to try to get in the way of establishing a better relationship with Russia. To me, protection of the Kurds, given the way that civil war goes, to a certain extent goes through having a good relationship with Russia. And we do have a moral obligation to look out for the Kurds. They are our allies.
But was it wrong, as far as you know and what you know now, to pull those troops out?
Well, I don't have to give you a hard answer because I assume I'm going to get private briefings this week. And maybe Mike Pompeo is going to say things that justify that decision. I did not like the decision, though, when I heard about it.
Are you concerned at all that this could cause a wider conflict? Because the Pentagon saying Friday they'll be sending U.S. troops to Saudi Arabia to try to help.
Well, I think they're probably sending the message that we're not pulling out of the Middle East altogether, which seems as a good message to send.
What do you think? What do you think the message is to our allies? What do you think other countries are learning from this?
Well, that's why I did not like the idea of pulling the troops out of Syria. Not only are you perhaps leaving the Kurds hanging there, and who knows what will happen to them, but I think for other countries around the world, we already have a problem. You know, when Barack Obama pulled out of Iraq, you know, that was a problem, you know, kind of leaving our allies hanging there. What happened under Barack Obama in Egypt was another example in which it appeared kind of we left our allies out to dry, all the way going back to Vietnam. You know, examples of letting our allies out to dry. And that's one of the reasons why it concerns me if we leave Syria without in some way protecting the Kurds. And I think that some way probably could have gone through Russia.
I do want to talk about the USMCA. What do you think the chances are of getting that passed?
It's gone back and forth every 2 weeks. Nancy Pelosi says we're going to vote on it in the next 2 months. I think it's hard for her to back off of that commitment. I know there is a strong element, I guess, in the Democrat Party that doesn't want it, I believe, take a vote. We should have voted on that thing 5 months ago. It's good for particularly the Wisconsin farmer, good for Wisconsin manufacturing. It's an improvement over what I thought was a flawed NAFTA deal cut by President Clinton. I think it's an example that only President Trump would have tried to tackle. You know, President Bush, President Obama, they didn't try to update this stuff. So I look forward to voting for it.
You think it'll go through?
Right now, I'm guessing yes, because Nancy Pelosi's put herself in a corner. But to be honest, my answer to that question seems to change every 2 weeks, depending on the gossip in Washington. Right now, my guess is yes within the next 2 months.
Congressman, thank you.
Glad to be on.